Thank you for kind introduction, Dr. Ha. Hello everyone. I am Maeng from Seoul National University of Education, and thank you for coming to this session. My topic is three terms: discourse register, language code, and practical epistemology analysis. I'm not sure all of you are familiar with these terms, but it is in this presentation, I will show some theoretical part and the practical part. So the first part of the presentation is about the theory, and the second part of the presentation is practical use of those three theoretical terms. Okay, in the theories part, I will show the journey on the road for language in science education since 2008. After my PhD dissertations. So the Vygotskian approach, G's idea about language acquisition, and Michael Halliday's view of language interpretation as register, and Bernstein's language code, and Duchel's epistemic discourse, and Bigman's practical epistemology analysis. I'm very happy we share our idea with the original author, Dr. Bigman. He's there. Yeah. As you know, Vygotsky's social-cultural perspective about the higher meta-functioning, such as understanding scientific concepts, begins from interpsychological plane first, and then go into intrapsychological plane. So in this process of internalization, language is used as a semiotic tool to mediate learners' interactional activities. I would like to ask you, how do learners construct interpsychological interaction by their discourse? And what do learners acquire with their discursive interactions? Is this scientific concepts? Is this social language of science, as Bakhtin said, species genre? Or is the language of science? About the language of science, I introduced G's idea about little d discourse and big D discourse. So for G, divided two functions of human language. One is to support the performance of social activities and identities. The other one is to support human affiliation within cultures, social groups, and institutions. So for these functions, he described the little d discourse and big D discourse. Little d discourse is only the language in use to enact activities and identities on sites situations, and to recognize or to be recognized as a member of social groups. The combined language with other stuff such as actions, interactions, values, beliefs, symbols, objects, tools, and place, and so on can be used. So G called it big D discourse. So we can think about two terms. So there is little d discourse in the big D discourse. Then, in case of science language or the language of science, what is the scientific little d discourse in big D discourse? For the language of science, the prevalent sentence by J. Linke, learning science is to learn how to communicate in the language of science and act as a member of scientific community. This idea is related to G's idea and Vygotsky's idea. So both scientific little d discourse and big D discourse are important to appropriate the language of science. So, but in my understanding, the language of science should not be confined to knowing and using scientific terms or vocabularies. It should be extended to understanding the social language in sciences. So to appropriate the language of science, I insisted the grammatical use of science language and epistemical use of science language can be learned and should be learned by learners. For the grammatical use of language of science, I employed the theory of register by Michael Halliday. For him, register is the language choice particular to any context of situations. So in the register theory, the social context can be analyzed by the three variables of language choice. So the first one is ideational metafunction, the second one is interpersonal metafunction, and the third one is textual metafunctions. The ideational mental function is related to who talks, what content, and which circumstances. So it is the representation of human experience. And the interpersonal mental function is the extent to control its power relations about information or actions in discourse. And the third one, the textual meta function, is a flow structure in the discourse. So in register theory, the textual meta function can be analyzed by the theme and rhyme structure. The theme is the first starting message in a clause, and the rest part of the clause is rhyme. So the relation between themes and between the rhymes can be the structure of the flow in this discourse. Another one is the referential and lexical continuity of the discourse texts are used to understand the textual metafunctions. For ideational metafunction and textual metafunctions, Halliday emphasized the grammatical metaphor in scientific English. So we can see a sentence such as A happened, so X happened. It is situation and situation, or phenomenon and phenomenon. And the conjunction so connect the first phenomenon and the second phenomenon. It is the relation. But in scientific English, the sentence transformed into happening X resulted from happening A. In this case, happening X is a nominal phrase, and happening A also nominal phrase, and resulted from happening A is a circumstance about the phenomenon of happening X. But the modern scientific English has the form of the third one. The result of happening A is happening X. So in this case, the effect is to make phenomena as things. So things and the relation is the feature of scientific English. So the third one, in the third case, the abstraction is much more stronger than the former two sentences. It is the grammatical metaphor, and the three sentences in the box, Halliday cited from the chemistry text. Have you read it? Would you read it, the three sentences? Okay, I will. If electrons were not absolutely indistinguishable, two hydrogen atoms would form a much more weakly bound molecule than they actually do. The absolute indistinguishability of the electrons in the two atoms give rise to an extra attractive force between them. The indistinguishability of electron is responsible for the structure of the periodic table. It is real scientific text, and we can see about the linguistic features of scientific language. And the first, the pink one, the pink part is the theme, and there is a relation among themes. There is a linkage. It is a thematic structure or a textual structure of the scientific register. But in the register theory, the ideational metafunction and textual metafunction are emphasized, much more emphasized than interpersonal metafunction. So I studied about the Bernstein's language code. For him, language code is a regulative principle which selects and integrates relevant meanings, forms of legitimate realizations, and evoking context. So in pedagogic social context, when we teach something to students, it is a pedagogic discourse or it is a pedagogic social context. To understand the pedagogic social context, there are two terms. One is the power relation between subjects, discourses, and spaces. And the other one is principle of control to establish legitimate forms of communications. The power relation can be analyzed by the classification, which is the degree of insulation between categories. So in this table, you can see the power relation between context and between participants. So the power relation is strong or weak. So when the case of the strong classification, I use plus C. Oh no, I and other scholars used plus C, and weak classification used minus C. And for the principle of control can be analyzed by the framing, which is the degree of discursive and hierarchical control within conversations. In the framing, for the framing, there are two terms: discourse initiative and hierarchical relations. So between teacher and students, who initiate the discourse? If a teacher initiates the discourse, it is strong framing, or a students initiate the discourse, it is weak framing. And for hierarchical relations, there are three cases. So imperative, positional, and personal. So imperative is very commandeering hierarchical relation, and positional framing is as an instructor. So to teach or to give something in the discourse, and the personal framing, a weak framing shows a teacher just provide personal idea as a discourse fellows. So, So in 2011, I showed the teamwork analysis, the triangular model for analyzing discourse register and language code. In this triangular model, the discourse context can be analyzed by procedure, recounting, explanation, reporting, or discussion. Those are the discourse genre. And based on the analysis of language code for the classification of discourse participants and the framing of discourse initiative and framing of hierarchical relation, I divided six categories of discourse styles. So the personal, collaborative, open discourse, and imperative, independent, controlled discourse. So in this diagram, he is a teacher and two students, and the size of the person is the power or initiative. So yeah. It is the example of teamwork analysis. Would you read this discourse episode a little? The situation of the discourse is a middle school teacher, science teacher, taught students to compare granite and granitic gneiss as metamorphic rocks. So after their observation, the teacher asked the result of students' observation. So this discourse episode clearly demarcated context with topical words such as granite changes, compare, differences, and so on. And so it showed the strong classification in the discourse context. And the teacher used interrogative mood choice. So she did not teach or give any information to students. She just asked about the result of the students' observation, and students answer to teachers' questions. So in this case, the discourse participants, the classification of discourse participants is a little weak, and the teacher works as a discourse fellows, not an instructor or not a commander. So the framing is a little weak. And the discourse initiative is also shows weak framing, because the sequence, the figures, round spotted and striped, or figures, it is students' new information in RIM. It can be it control the sequencing of the discourse. So I analyzed it as a weak framing of discourse initiative. It is the case of the teamwork analysis. For the epistemic use of language of science, I employed the epistemic discourse and practical epistemology analysis. The epistemic use of language of science is a language action used in carrying out epistemic practices in science learning activities. For the epistemic practices, Jimenez and Alexander showed like this, to collecting data through observation, identifying evidence, and establishing a model, and constructing an explanation for a phenomenon based on Duchel's evidence and explanation continuum. This diagram is Duchel's evidence and explanation continuum. So from the data, through evidence, pattern and models, and construct an explanation. But students should decide if a data can be evidence. And students, they identify some patterns and models based on the evidence, and they develop an explanation based on the pattern or models. Between each categories, students or teachers and students can make epistemic discourse to transform from data to evidence, from evidence to pattern, from pattern to explanations. It is the epistemic discourse. And for the epistemic use of language of science, I employed Dr. Bigman's practical epistemology analysis. I will show it a little more. For the term practical epistemology, William Sandoval also used the same term, but the meaning of practical epistemology is different from Bigman's practical epistemology. For Sandoval's, practical epistemology is personal belief about personal epistemological beliefs about science. So to understand students' practical epistemology, he insisted for questions. Scientific knowledge is constructed. The scientific method is diverse. What is the form of scientific knowledge? Scientific knowledge varies in certainty. It is the question. Those are questions to understand how children think about science or scientific knowledge. It is the epistemological belief, but in Wigman's practical epistemology is a situated description of actions actually used in learner's speech. So, in his idea, epistemology used in science practices. So, when students have a scientific do a scientific practices, what they count as relevant knowledge and how they acquire their knowledge, and how learners make meanings in discourse change. It is the perspective of Wigman's idea about practical epistemology. And to analyze learners' practical epistemology, Wigman employed 4 categories: encounter, stand fast, gap, and relations. I will explain it a little later. Okay, so the second part is the practical part. In the case of Korean elementary students, language use when they learn geoscience concepts. And I examined students' register and practical epistemology and analysis. So it is the study. Yep. I used the data. I used the register and practical epistemology analysis to analyze the discourse data. Okay. Yeah. It is the 4 categories about Wigman's practical epistemology analysis. Encounter is a specific situation in which learners meet or interact with person or material. So, in an encounter, what occurs in a discourse? what is taught or what words are used can show. So if we analyze an encounter, we can understand those features. And in an encounter, learners, the language uses clearly can be understood without any questions because they already learn about the situation. Then we can, Wingman say it is stand fast. In this case, fast is not the word about the speed. When you are getting on the airplane, you listen, fasten your seatbelt. So the fast means keep an idea fixed in your mind. It is a stand fast. And whether stand fast or not is analyzed by the relations of similarities or differences between consecutive utterances. So in the discourse context, the first sentence and the second sentence, the relations can make. And the relations there are similarities or differences between the consecutive utterances, then we can say, we can think about it is steadfast or not. And the gap is when learners meet an encounter which it does not stand fast to them, then it can make a gap. So if learners establish a new relation between what students already know and what is new in the gap occurring encounter, the gap can be filled or not. So if the gap is filled, then the new experience is transformed. And we can say they learned about the new information. But all gaps are successfully filled with the new relations. Then the new relation, the gaps are still linger. And based on the epistemic role of each stem fast or gap in a discourse changes, the utterance of relation can be assigned to a evidence and explanation continuum. I call it a practical epistemology diagram. I will show it a little later. Okay. This is the episode 1 about deciding the criteria for observing rocks. So before the elementary children observe sedimentary rock, they should have to decide what is the criteria for their observation. So would you read this very short excerpt? First, I introduced the register analysis, and the second, the practical epistemology analysis can be shown. Ideationally, in this discourse, the action verbs and relational verbs are used about the write down, look at, and so on. So, and the content words such as rock, color, shape, size, it shows about the context of this discourse. And interpersonally, the discourse texts are unfolded from the suggestion through personal rejection and authoritative rejections. The suggestion is, what about the shapes of rocks? But Julie said, shape is not good. So it is the personal rejection. And is it good, the size of rocks? Then Julie said, teacher said, we do not use shape or size. So it is the rejection, but based on the teacher's authority. It is interpersonal relations. And the red terms is a theme of the clause, and green or blue terms are rim, information in rim. And those themes and rims are connected about the content. And so this discourse text has the textual relations, and there are three relations. So one is the color, grain, and the feature of rocks, and this relations has the similarity, but the various shapes and features of rocks, the relation, and the relation between features of rocks and various size has different relations. So for the color, grain size, this relation stood fast for students, but the shape or size, the relation between features and shape or size were not stood fast, so it makes a gap, and during the discourse, the gap was not filled. And this relation, this relation can work as an evidence from their everyday experience. So I will design. I made a practical epistemology diagram. So it is the relation, first relation, second relation, and third relation, and the role of each relation is assigned. So it is this relation is stemfast, but this stemfast did not have any role about any epistemic role, data, evidence, pattern, explanation. But these two relations have the role of the evidence. So I use this diagram. The second episode is like this. I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah. Please read it again. The grain size is like a mud. I'm not able to see any grain size in this rock. And we need a magnifier to see the grain size. I cannot see, and very small, it's smaller than 1 millimeter. I cannot see about 1 millimeter, too small to see like this. So in this case, there are three relations. One is the mud-sized grain and not able to see. This relation the students got this relation from their observation, and this relation has the role of the data. And there are other similarity relation between small grains and smaller than 1 millimeter. It had the evidence, the role of evidence, and there are different relations. So I also made the diagram of practical epistemology diagram like this. So the difference between the former diagram is the gap. There are two stemfast and one gap. And this is the final episode. So one student scratched a mud stone, and he said grains came out. But the other students, it is not a grain. It is not a grains. It's just powder. So the students said, if we crack a piece of grains, then it turns smaller. So, but the teacher team said the grain size does not change according to the sort of sedimentary rocks. So Julie said, then there are many kinds of grains. So Julie also said multi-size grains. In this case, the students filled their gap with their discussion. So the practical epistemology diagram could be drawn by this. So So the whole practical epistemology diagram is this. So yeah. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that although inducing pattern and constructing explanation were not clearly administered by elementary students, but they could establish data and evidence from their observation of grain size of sedimentary rocks. And the students' epistemic cognition to construct knowledge about sedimentary rocks through their discursive interaction was productive. Actually, it is not the same as scientists want, but they have the capacity to make understanding, the epistemic understanding, based on their discussions. Okay, and the final comments about the language analysis, I would like to say the role of researchers and teachers cannot be the same about the language analysis. So as a researcher, I analyze the specific features from the students' discussion, and the result of the study can be employed by the teacher when they teach science to their students. It is my recommendation. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very amazed, how we can analyze student discourse in very detail, in such a detailed size. Actually, I'm not very familiar with such the study area, but it's very good opportunity to learn about the many theories and actual research is yeah. So we have about 8 minutes for the Q&A. So if you have any question, I will deliver this the mic to you. Oh yeah, the second. Oh.
Well, I thought maybe Fair should go first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So maybe. Oh yeah. Okay.
Are you sure? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say I really appreciated hearing your talk, and I wanted to go to the final point that you made and ask you, when working with pre-service teachers and in-service elementary school teachers, how do you as a researcher use this information? What do you try and have your teachers gain from thinking about students' discourse in science in this way?
Okay, thank you for good questions. In my experience, I recorded my teaching, and I analyzed my discourse as a teacher. Then I was so surprised. The register of my talk was not good for teaching science content to students. So if we analyze discourse between teacher and students, and if we give the result to the teacher, then the teacher can think about his or her own talking habit or the style of their teaching discourse, and how do students talk about the content, or how does a teacher talk about the content, or how does a teacher construct the classroom discourse. The information can has the role to improve their teaching style, and the result of the practical epistemology analysis can show some gaps. So when learners feel a gap between what they already know and what they meet a new encounter, then if the gap is not filled, then teacher has the information how to control his or her teaching, or the teaching style, or teaching way of the content. So it is my recommendation.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So, very interesting presentation. I have no comment on your use of practical epistemology as such, but I think I really like the way you eclectically, I would say, combine these different ways of analyzing discourse and showing. I learned a lot, seeing what these different models mean for analyzing what's happening in the classroom. And I think that this is typically, we do courses with teacher students and also with teachers. They study different ways of analyzing discourse in our courses, and then they make recordings, either of their own teaching or of a teacher's teaching, and they adopt these different models, and you suggested new models that we could introduce to help them analyze them. And what they typically do then is that they use practical epistemology to assess what's happening through the other models. For example, Lemke's or Mortimer and Scott or whatever it is, and they see what the consequences are by using the practical epistemology of the different ways of classifying discourse. So I was very inspired by your talk.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know, it wasn't any question.
Yes, I got that. Thanks. And you also wrote the paper about the practical epistemology in 2002, 2004, and 2006, and there are a little more papers. Then after I read his paper, I think the practical epistemology analysis has the content analysis in the discourse, but the register analysis or language code analysis, those studies did not have the specific content. When learners learn study science content and how they talk about something. So practical epistemology analysis has a specific stronger point than other way. And the other point is, in my understanding, practical epistemology analysis a little easier for us to understand the process of analysis, but register analysis and language code analysis is much more difficult for a novice researcher to understand and employ the way of analysis.
Yeah, and of course, different discourse models were developed for different purposes, and some were originally developed for text analysis. So we had to adapt them in different ways. And of course, epistemology was developed from a teacher perspective. So what can I see in the classroom? So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute, so I think we can have the last question. Any others? Then maybe I have a question. So I think I believe I'm not very careful when I have to talk. So actually I don't think I'm very aware of my talking, so do you think if I analyze my discourse, do you think I can change my discourse, or it's kind of habit, talking. I'm more than 40 years old, so that I usually teacher also do you think that they can change their talking habit or others by analyze their discourse? I'm just curious about your.
Okay. As a science educators, we always, not always, but we usually say that Vygotskian social constructivism is a useful way to teach science content. But in Vygotsky's idea or any other scholar's idea, language is important to give something to others. Then, if we think about the importance of language, then although we have a habit of talking, if the habit is not good, then we think again about our habit of talking. So, because it is the reason the theme of this international conference is language. So, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So please give another big round of applause to the Professor Maeng, for his nice talk. Thank you. I have announcement. So general meeting will be held here. So you can stay and thank you so much.